So my PhD project was investigating human visual bias in narratives about other animals. I'm thinking particularly about visual metaphors and focalization from an ecological psychology perspective. But I'm going to talk today about a project that I did, which I was sort of supposed to do in the middle of my PhD, but with the lockdown, it ended up being right at the end, in fact, just after my funded time. So I did an international placement scheme funded by the AHRC, thank you, at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, working with the freshwater mussel collection in the invertebrate zoology department. So I was doing this so I had this proposal based on, I suppose, or using my artistic background, and my background as a librarian and formerly archives manager, to do some collections-based research. And taking, I suppose, this sort of ecological psychology approach, which, if anyone knows the writings of J.J. Gibson, is quite influential on cognitive narratology. He talks about thinking about ways of life in environments. Having some sort of access to other animals through thinking about how they inhabit their environments. He's talking about humans, but it can be extended. He talks in some of his work about other animals. And I suppose I'm using this, and this is quite old work, but I'm going back to this because even in contemporary cognitive science and cognitive narratology, there's not a focus on visuality, but he focuses on vision, which is pretty useful for my project. And there's sort of more recent thought about which carries on from this, extends from this, about 4E cognition, thinking about how cognition is embedded in and inseparable from environments, and that's very much part of my approach. So my project at the Smithsonian, my proposal is to investigate the life history and evolutionary history of freshwater mussels in the River Potomac, and to sort of look at the other species that form part of their ecosystem and their wider ecosystem and how they inhabit the river. So working in collaboration with the research zoologists there to focus on their sensory perceptions, cognition, what's known about their cognition and behavior from observation, and how these relate to their morphology or body shape that's evolved, and how they can be interpreted from this ecological psychology perspective, which I hope will become clear throughout the talk. For a role-playing game, ultimately, based on the collections. The picture here is a plain pocketbook mussel. And they produce these amazing lures. So it looks like a fish shape on top of the shell, which attracts bigger fish to take their babies, so the baby mussels hitch a ride on the gills of bigger fish. So these lures are sort of an example, I suppose, of this ecological psychology approach. They show how mussels, although they can't see, they don't have eyes like we do, but they do use vision. They just use it differently to humans. They produce these sort of kinetic sculptural representations of fish for vertebrate eyes, even though they can't see them themselves. And so this is part of how they're embedded in and part of the river ecosystem. They're also, they're amazing creatures. They habitat forming, they're really important for multi-species communities, and they filter the water, so they keep the river clean and they provide homes for other animals. And they tend to live in sort of multi-species communities. So I got to Washington D.C. in the snow, the Natural History Museum, and as I got there in January, it went back into lockdown. So I spent my first 6 weeks of my fellowship in a room in an Airbnb. But this sort of gave me the opportunity, although I was working remotely, to spend some time with interpreting the catalogue and doing some literary research. So my task was sort of to turn this pretty dry catalogue records into some sort of narrative material. So to pick out the information from the records, which sort of vary in their level of detail, and think about, with the support of the research zoologist. So I was really lucky to work with a freshwater mussels specialist, the freshwater mussels curator, John Pfeiffer, at the Natural History Museum. And there was another research fellow there at the same time, Sean Keogh, who was also researching mussel morphology, so this was really useful. So to pick out information from the catalogue records, to first of all identify which mussels have been found historically in the Potomac River, so there's 17 different species, and to draw on John and Sean's expertise to find scientific papers that would help me explore a little bit better about their characteristics. And at the same time, to sort of draw on literary sources, to think about a narrative structure and a sort of concept for the work that I was doing. So this isn't entirely what I'd planned to do, but I found this 14th century epic poem, which is probably really familiar to students of English literature and no one outside of that, called Pearl. And Pearl is an epic. It's about a parent mourning for the loss of a child. And I sort of turned this into, well, my aim was to turn this into a lament for species loss and extinction in the Potomac, but also a sort of quest along the Potomac to talk about the different parts of the Potomac River and the mussels' habitat. So I was drawing on Simon Armitage's translation, as well as Sarah Stansbury's Middle English edition, and translations by Sophie Jewett and J.R.R. Tolkien, better known for The Lord of the Rings. So I wasn't just sitting in my room. I took the opportunity to do a lot of walks along by the river, do some desk research about the river's history, and I found an amazing book from the Rivers of America series about the Potomac, which had some beautiful engravings in it. It's from the 60s, I think. So, and you can see, like, as I was there for 3 months, you know, the environment changes and the river changes all along the Potomac. So it goes from quite a wide river to a really little river, and right at the end of my stay, we did a field trip to the Great Falls, which are like the sort of photo moment. And, lots of tourists go there, really beautiful. So thinking about the environment, the whole ecosystem, and of course from a human perspective, its history and human impacts over time. So, and that's a map. So from the beginning by Chesapeake Bay, it goes all the way up through several counties. So these changes from deeps to shallows to rapids to calms. And at the same time, I was sort of mapping where the different mussels had been found along the river. Although, I mean, and I realize a lot of it's really inaccessible. You can't walk along all of it. I sort of really understood why a lot of the collectors from the collection, they've been found near bridges, because bridges are the most accessible places. So finally, after 6 weeks, I get into the archive. And And I mean, the archive really is mostly on site, is mostly a collection of shells. So I got to look through all the shells, which maybe sort of brought it a little bit more to life, even though they're dead shells. So these are Lasmagonus subviridis, one of the species from the Potomac. The name is green floater. And these are really like thin-shelled, so their thin shells afford like living in softer substrates, like in sand and silt. It's an endangered and threatened species. Because of their thin shells, they tend to be found in the smaller streams. They don't really like strong currents. So they'll be found in the quiet pools, eddies, and canals. This species doesn't have a host fish that takes their young up the river. So the young tend to stay close by. And they're interesting because they have within, they have both male and female sexual characteristics. So they're thought, it's not really very well understood, but they're thought to be able to self-inseminate, particularly in times of scarcity. And they look after their young within their gills rather than sending them upstream. And you can say this is the inside. They vary a lot on the inside in colour. So this all came together in this epic poem. So I adapted the poem Pearl. I used the structure, which had sort of some limitations, but so I was sort of trying to use the same sort of rhyming scheme, the same metaphor, but to change the metaphor. So it's sort of centered on this metaphor of the pearl, very much in the original version from a human perspective. Pearls as being something precious and beautiful, and the narrator is talking about their daughter who they lost as their pearl, and also that pearl now in heaven behind the pearly gates. So I'm using the metaphor of pearl as, in a different way, sort of ecologically, pearl to a mussel is a substance that they secrete that hardens. It coats the inside of their shell so that their shell doesn't hurt their soft bodies. It also coats any parasites or bits of grit that get into their shell to protect them again. So it has a very different meaning. So yeah, the poem became the outcome rather than the role-playing game. But it's also a good place to start the sort of narrative basis of a role-playing game that I'm coming back to now to develop. I mean, there are quite a lot of limitations working with an existing structure. And there are pros and cons. I suppose, you know, in terms of like the quest format of the poem, it works quite well with the genre of role-playing games. It's engaging, but there are also sort of religious overtones that are hard to avoid. But sort of thinking about the sort of ghosts of the mussels that have died, rather than a Christian heaven or something. And so this is my starting point for the work that I'm doing now, developing the role-playing game, tentatively called Aquaforming the Potomac. There's a role-playing game called Terraforming Mars, which is incredibly colonial. You go to Mars and you turn it into a place for human habitation. But I'm sort of trying to invert things and think about how mussels actually aquaform the river habitat and make it livable for all kinds of species. So I'm just at the beginning of doing some more sort of literary and visual research for this. These are some very, very rough sketches in Photoshop. So I'm putting together a sort of deck of different characters, and thinking about their characteristics, their visual characteristics, the idea of, for the Lesmogona subviridis, like these sort of soft interiors, the way that they look after their children, they're both male and female. And for a species like the Strophitis undulatus, which has, this is a juvenile in the left-hand corner, has these massive teeth. It looks a bit like Pac-Man, and it snaps onto the fish as they pass. But it's much more parasitic. So, sorry? Okay, yes, good. So thank you to 3D3, the HRC International Placement Scheme, and the Natural History Museum. And to say, so my next steps now are to work up the artwork. I've got a month at Cyprus College of Art coming up to do some paintings, and then I'll bring it back to where I work at Ethic Lab, and we'll put together a pitch deck. I'll work with the designer and the rest of the team, who many of whom are very into role-playing games, and look for partners to develop the game and find some funding. And with Ethic Lab, we build machine learning models, AI, and we work on all sorts of digital projects. So we'll be building a sort of dynamic model of the ecosystem and working with groups of role players to test and iterate. And that's me. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Kaajal Modi. I have recently submitted my PhD, which was called Kitchen Cultures, and looked at multi-species co-creation with invisible cultures in the kitchen. So as part of that, I was supervised by Teresa Dillon from the Digital Cultures Research Centre here at UE Bristol. And I was also partly supervised by Professor Emma Beekamp, who is head of the Science Communication Unit, also at UE Bristol. And I'd also like to thank the 3D3 Doctoral Training Partnership. Because it's been so recent that I submitted my PhD, this is the first time where I guess I'm actually talking about it out loud to a group of people. So I hope you'll forgive me for any sort of vagueness and call me up on it, actually, because this can be like a practice fiver. I was freaking myself out earlier by calling it a practice fiver in my head. So Kitchen Cultures was a practice-based PhD where I developed a design-led, my background is as a designer, and arts-inspired research practice working with food fermentation techniques as materialities and metaphors through which to explore how culture and climate interrelate in global cuisines. So the project explores the concept of co-creation as an act of co-production with diverse publics on two levels. So firstly, as a material practice through which to culture ingredients in collaboration with the microbial cultures that we coexist with and have co-evolved with, and then that also live in and on our foods, in and on our bodies, that live in our homes and our kitchens. So there's lots of research recently that shows how microbially biodiverse our indoor environments are, and that became a strand that I'm continuing to explore. So secondarily, this works as a means to explore the epistemic and metaphoric world-making in which we as humans engage when we make with each other. So that means, what do we understand as creating together when we co-create? What are we co-creating? Is it just the thing that we're making? Is it the knowledge that's produced as part of the making process? Is it an unholy combination of both, or something else entirely? So the work focuses on exploring how these kitchen practices mediate our understanding of invisible cultures. So this idea of invisible cultures became very, very key because part of the way through my PhD, I was originally working with We the Curious, and due to lockdown, it shut down, entirely got reshuffled, and that partnership entirely fell apart. And I was really lucky to get the opportunity to work with the Eden Project. And the Eden Project had, at the time, an exhibition called Invisible Worlds, and they were really interested in this idea of working with microbial cultures as an invisible culture, but I was also talking about the fact that in a lot of the conversations I was having about how we co-create, who we co-create with, another culture that was invisible was women, femmes, women of colour, women from the global majority, and so I was also keen to bring in those invisible cultures into the conversations that we were having around the future of food and sustainability and ecology. So I guess the way I framed it was that these are invisible cultures that we cannot see because they are too small, too big, or too abstracted, or whether they are those who have been deliberately or incidentally invisibilized through unjust socio-technical arrangements. So ultimately, the work intends to outline a practice framework for practice researchers working in public engagement in topics to do with sustainability, culture, climate, food. So although Sophie, yesterday asked me, when you go and look at my exhibition in Sparks, you'll notice there is a care package there that is full of jars. And Sophie asked me, what is in the jar? And I said, that could have been my research question. What is in every single jar? So for me, multi-species co-creation negotiates the more than human in the form of my human collaborators and in the form of the foods we're cooking, because they are vegetables and fruits, so they are more than human themselves, and also the ambient microbes in our environment and the ecosystems these organisms entangle us with. So in so doing, I argue that we can learn much about how these human cultural practices have co-evolved alongside microbial and geographical ecologies. I suggest that fermenting with the microbes on our foods, in our kitchens, in our hands, and in and on our bodies is a form of tacit relationality that emerges through the act of practicing, so through the act of fermenting. So I'm going to come back to that. So as well as my own individual practice of fermentation, which I was engaging with in my kitchen over lockdown, as many of us were, it turns out. I also explored these ideas through 2 residencies. Just before lockdown, I was at Media Lab Prado in Madrid, where they were looking at the future of food, and there we looked at dehydration more than fermentation, but we were looking at food preservation. And then I did a fermentation residency at We the Curious called the Cafe, and this was a public engagement activity, which actually I'm not sure how well it worked because the audience at We the Curious was mostly young children and their carers, and so I found myself operating in a kind of like, one-way scientific education model, and actually what I wanted to do was much more about scientific engagement and creating knowledge together. So that became like maybe the basis of what I did next. So that became the basis of the residency with the Eden Project, which was called Kitchen Cultures, and I worked there with a chef, a poet, and 6 other women from the global majority in the UK to recover and develop recipes to reduce food waste. And I'll talk about that framing a bit more as well. And I'll come back to the outcomes from Kitchen Cultures. So if you do want to find out more about the outcomes, though, I would say go and check out the exhibition at Sparks, because I have said this throughout my research. The work only works in relation to the practice outcomes. Unless you're engaging with the practice, it doesn't make sense. So these are the research questions that actually emerged at the end, because that's one of the things that I think you'll find with practice research. You're constantly in negotiation with your research questions. It's like, the thing that I found out has helped me redefine the problem space. And I'm still not sure if these were the questions that I answered, but these are the ones that I landed on when I got to submission stage. So I was, let's be honest, we all did that. So the questions I was interested in at that point is, how do we as design researchers develop a practice of making through food with global majority women as a way to draw out tacit, subtle, relational knowledge on the ways in which culture and ecology are entangled? Now, this idea of relationality, entanglement, interdependence, these are like really, really popular ideas in the feminist technosciences and science studies right now. But they're not new ideas. They've existed for a really long time, and actually they are practiced in many ways through just everyday things that we do, like cooking in the kitchen. And I suspected, and this sort of turned out to be true, that there's a lot of knowledge about this that lives in migrant cuisines. And so as a result, I was very keen to draw that out. And then how can attending to the kitchen practices that are tacitly negotiating with the multi-species attune us as researchers to how women in diaspora communities maintain their cultures through practices of more than human care? So when I talk about cultures, I talk about human and microbial and ecological cultures. Now, human cultures, we tend to share we tend to share and create cultures through storytelling. And I find it really interesting that like microbes and particularly bacteria engage in horizontal gene transfer. And so that's one of the ways in which they tell stories. And I kind of move between this kind of materiality and metaphor. I've been told, sometimes perhaps quite glibly, but I find it a useful way to move between both ideas. So again, feel free to pull me up on it. And since ways of knowing and practicing multi-species entanglements can often go unspoken when working across differing cultures, often due to uncertainty and slippage with language, sorry, this is the next slide, and of the differing ontologies that underpin them, the different worlds that we all occupy based off of the way that we be and know in the world. A third question the research asks is, how do we develop a multimedia representation of this tacit, subtle, and performative forms of knowledge? And how can this facilitate further encounter outside of the research context in ways that invite their own ecological co-productions? So how can what we know be embodied through practice in ways that invite other ways of knowing and being? So this practice kind of, so this is like an earlier iteration of my theoretical framework that I've called sort of multi-species co-creation. So I argue this offers, well, it draws from feminist cosmopolitics, science communication, co-creation, and then these are sort of the crossover points. These are the areas where people are doing, I think, what I find to be really, really compelling work. And I think my training as a designer forces me to think about this as a design practice, but I've been told it looks like an artistic practice. But the reason for me it's a design practice is, for me, it's the act of designing together and of claiming kitchen practices as a form of design that helps situate this knowledge as its own way of knowing and being that is valid in its own right. And I think I find it frustrating as someone who was trained in design and did study social design that actually only certain forms of knowledge were validated. And often the knowledge of women in the kitchen was not part of that. In fact, it was never part of that. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just repeating myself here. So these multi-species ontologies are alive and responsive to their conditions, and they've been adapted to context through migration as a practice of survival. And so what I wanted to do was invite, because as part of this I also spoke to lots of people who were working with fermentation in interesting ways, and one of the things that there's a guy called Sandor Katz who is very well known in fermentation circles, who I managed to like have an incredible conversation with when he was at the Abergavenny Food Festival in 2019, again just before lockdown. And he was saying there's no new forms of fermentation. We've kind of discovered, it's very colonial language, them all. We've probably there is a culture out there that is engaging with every single fermentation practice that we can know because we've already done it, we've already co-evolved alongside it, and we're engaging in it. There's only new forms of hybrid and heretical practice, which involve people going, actually this practice could work in this context, we've never done it before, because we didn't have access to these ingredients, or we didn't have access to temperature controlling technologies, or we didn't have access to humidity controlling technologies. So it's about, like, it is a technological practice, but it's one that has been working with ecology and geography for a really long time. So really, I'm going to skip forward for a second, because let's start with this. What is fermentation? So fermentation in food and drink promotes the growth and life cycle of microscopic organisms to transform the flavor and shelf life of ingredients. Fermentation is believed to make foods more nutritious, and I think the delicious is more important, but to make it more nutritious or easily digestible, I think, because often you talk about these things as being pre-digested, as well as delicious. Fermentation is found throughout human cultures. I think there's one one tribe that, as far as we know, does not ferment as part of their food practice. And I think they're somewhere in the Himalayas, and it's just because they have access, they're nomadic people who have access to fresh food at all times. And I find that really fascinating. It means that our food practices are so intimately connected to geographies, and we're used to thinking of these as cultural practices. And I guess in a way, that's why I kind of keep pushing this idea that these are more than cultural practices. Because often we think of non-European cultures as being fixed in time, as static, as cultural, but actually they're also ecological and scientific and contain so much more than that. So fermentation is also a word that can mean to agitate, excite, or trouble. And at its broadest definition, fermentation is a metabolic process in which every form of life is constantly engaging. So it's quite broad, and I don't know, like I think a lot of people I know who are working in this space end up using it as a metaphor for everything because it works really well as a metaphor for everything. So just to go back, these were some of the ideas that I was drawing from, I think probably when I was building my lens or my research framework. So there's Kelly Donati in the convivial table talks about multi-species gastronomy, which is a way of attending to the multiple appetites and lively interactions inherent in the act of producing food. Could it reshape the material and conceptual ways in which we share the world with others? Now, she's talking about producing food. However, is cooking food production? What about eating food? And actually, after this, Anne-Marie Moll released a book called Eating in Theory, where she talks about whether we can know the world by eating it, like by attending in the by engaging in the metabolic process of eating, can we know the world? And I find that very compelling too. This is another definition, I guess, of fermentation in a different way. Microbial cultures are essential to life's processes, such as digestion and immunity. We're in a symbiotic relationship with these single-cell life forms, but symbiotic doesn't mean mutually beneficial. I would just like to note that. Lynn Margulis talks about how we have different forms of symbiosis. They can be commensal, which means that both parties, hang on, let me make sure I get this definition right. Parasitic, which means that one party benefits at the expense of the other. Commensal, which means that neither benefits, well, kind of they just coexist. Or mutualistic, in which both benefit. And I think when we talk about symbiosis, we often mean that latter definition, but actually it doesn't always mean that. So microflora digest food into nutrients our bodies can absorb, protect us from potentially dangerous organisms, and teach our immune systems how to function. Microorganisms are our ancestors and allies. I love that phrase, and I think you see it a lot in fermentation circles. They're our ancestors and allies. Oh, wow, okay. I'm just going to skip to the end, guys. So I've talked about fermentation as material, I've talked about it as metaphor, and then I guess I also play with it as social function. I'm going to quickly introduce you to my collaborators so that when you go and engage with the exhibition at Sparks, you'll know who you're listening to and speaking to. So, just because I put a little note about them. Well, we'll just go from the top. Eklas, who was one of the collaborators. She's Sudanese, she's amazing. She didn't tell us how old she was, but she was recruited into the project by her daughters. Peppa, who is an incredible artist and performer in her own right. She's currently touring her show, which is called Eating Myself, where she basically talks about her relationship to food through the process of making her grandmother's soup, which she serves you at the end, and it is delicious. There's Victoria Pokuamanfo, or V. V is a Jamaican, Ghanaian diaspora child, as she would call herself, and so she's always trying to bring those two cultures together in the way in which she cooks and eats. Wrinkle, who was amazing, she was like the person who made every single recipe that we ever mentioned in the group chat or when we spoke to each other. Soha, who was just this beautiful art child who just came in and like just absorbed all of the knowledge and then just produced this amazing poetry. And Sabutseng, who is from Zimbabwe, and she brought like an interesting thing in our first meeting where she brought a Zimbabwean achar. Now, achar is a North Indian pickle, and we kind of don't know how it's made its way to Zimbabwe, but it's really common. And the word achar, like so many of these pickles, just means sour. Torshi means sour. I'm pretty sure kimchi means sour. So this became the language that we use to talk about these things, because fermentation, just quickly, these were the responses we got to fermentation. My kitchen doesn't have germs. I don't drink alcohol. So we had to find all this other language. And it was really interesting how this idea of cheating became really, really key. It's like, oh, I couldn't get it to rise in this climate, so I added yogurt. That was cheating. That's not the authentic way, because that's not the way my mother or my grandmother would have done it. And I find it really fascinating as well, because there's the public perception of microbes as dirty, dangerous, and disease-causing, which comes from the germ theory of disease. Now, this coincides with colonization. And I think it's no coincidence that it echoes descriptions of the natives by colonizers, and this also then echoes the way that we talk about migration as an encroachment on the national body in the present day. For example, there's lots of research to show that this is language that was talked about Asian people East Asian people when COVID was on the rise, and it led to a rise in hate crime against people of East Asian origin. I'm going to stop there, but quickly. This was the framework I ended up with. So this is the theoretical framework, and then the practice outcomes are the ones that you can engage with at Sparks. And there.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jane Moss, Falmouth. I live very near some mussel beds, and I'm never going to look on them in the same way again, I don't think. So, what you're looking at here is a map, or an illustrated map of a fictional rural and coastal place called Trevaux. If there are any Cornish speakers in the room, you may know the meaning of Trevaux. It means home, and with home, that sense of belonging. And it's the title of a community novel, which was the research subject of my participatory action research, which has taken place. I started the practice aspect of it in October 2018, and with a few breaks, the novel was complete by late summer 2020. 2020. So it overlapped a bit with the lockdown period, and I'll be referring to the effects of that. This was drawn by somebody called Ginny Barker, who was one of many volunteers in this participatory project. And it was the result of many conversations among many people about the world that they were building in which to locate this novel, which they were going to make together. And I say make rather than write, because one of the things I was looking at was how the community novel can be a vehicle for participation and exactly what that means. And it's all started with a question, which was an AHRC question. Thank you very much. This was posed in 2017 at a conference about community writing at Dragon Hall in Norwich, which is where the National Centre for Writing is located. And it was co-hosted by AHRC, the Writers' Centre, and also UEA. And I thought, what a great question is that? It really got me thinking about how a practitioner like me, and I'm a writer who facilitates community writing groups with people who are not professional writers, they're not even particularly career writers, they're not interested really in formal learning, they're not part of a university or even adult education. They're simply coming to do writing in their communities as part of a creative activity, a leisure activity, and for many it's a social activity as well. You know, they enjoy it. They're a little community of practice sharing their enthusiasm for creative writing. But would they ever publish anything? Yes, they might, but that's not really the prime purpose. So I thought, okay, let's see how my niche of literature, which takes place in and with communities, could help to answer that question. So these are the research questions I've been working to, and by the way, I'm quite close to finishing writing up now. Oh, if I don't submit this thing soon, I think I'll have to shoot myself. Anyone else feel like that? Yes. So these research questions, the headline one is that first one there. It's how can the novel be a vehicle for community participation? But very interestingly, as I've been writing it up, what has increasingly been foregrounded is the second point there, the role of the facilitator. Because in the process of finding out the answer to the first question, of course, I've had to facilitate a community novel. In order to find out how you make one, you have to make one. And in the process of that, my practice and the tools that I use, my sort of palette of methods have been expanded tremendously. And part of the reason for that is the third question, how can digital methods be integrated into practice? The people I normally work with, the groups I work with, and they're meeting in community centres, village halls, charities, you know, all kinds of public places like that. They're working with pens. You know, I'm probably the most lo-fi person in the room in terms of research methods, but there is a reason for that. It's because of who the participants are. But nonetheless, you know, I have arrived at a kind of blended practice that amalgamates digital methods, particularly smartphone apps, you know, very simple use of smartphone apps to help generate material for the novel. Now, here's, so a little bit more here on facilitating participation. The 64 Million Artists report for the Arts Council, it's called Cultural Democracy in Practice, came out in 2018. And one of the themes of that is looking at the role of facilitators and the way that recasting the leader as a facilitator opens up culture to far wider numbers of artists, audiences, and participants. And I'm particularly interested in participants. This is not a novel I would ever write myself. This is a novel that I have, if you like, enabled or perhaps even elicited from the people who've contributed to it. And then Francois Matarasso, whose work I've been following as a community practitioner probably since the 80s. A couple of days ago, this pops up on his Selfless Art blog. It's a pleasure and a privilege to listen to someone talk about their ideas and experience, their dreams, desires and hopes. The material and form of artistic co-creation comes out of such conversations. So there's that conversation word. And when I read this, I thought, yes, that's exactly what I've been doing. Now, normally, a creative writing group in a community setting, it's individuals who are working on their own stuff. They come together into a little community of practice to critique, to share, to support each other, to workshop, but they're not writing something together. And when they're in that room writing, it's pretty quiet. You know, it's a peaceful space. That hush where you hear the scratch of the pen on the paper is one of my favourite sounds in the world. Facilitating a community novel is not like that at all. It's really noisy. It's really loud. It's a succession of very lively conversations. And part of the skills I've developed is a kind of active listening. And a means of holding those conversations, a group conversation, so that all voices are heard, all ideas are put on the table, nobody says no in the first instance, And eventually through discussion and drafting and trying things out and improvisation, sometimes physical, sometimes role play, sometimes writing, sometimes in apps, you arrive at a consensus and then you can move forward. For world building for this story, the map I showed you earlier, we used Pinterest. We used Pinterest boards to create a series of settings, rooms, buildings, indoors, outdoors. And we did some of those sessions by remote online. I held some remote sessions just to see how that would compare to being in the room with people. And this third quote comes from a lady called Joanna, who was one of the volunteers. Joanna doesn't have a smartphone, she doesn't have a laptop, she doesn't have an email address, she's not into that kind of thing at all. And she said, when you do that computer stuff, I can't join in. So, you know, this is something that has to be listened to. This is something that has to be attended to. So that drove me even more, I think, into methods that were blended. I thought, well, okay, we're going to use Pinterest, but how can I make sure that Joanna can take part in that? And the answer was to get her in a room with someone else who was doing it and for them to work side by side, shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't difficult, but in its way, that was quite innovative, and it showed how you can mix the two. At a stage in the research, I asked the participants in the community novel what they thought my role was. I thought, well, I'm getting a sense of what it is, but how are they experiencing it? And this is what they told me. And you see how big the glue is in the middle. And so several of them said, you are the glue that is holding us together. And I would say that in the early stages, that was probably true. I was the one who was setting the routines, suggesting the tasks, providing a kind of roadmap for them so that they could gradually generate and build up material for what would become their novel. I was certainly the memory bank. There was so much. None of us could remember everything, so that was me. I was certainly a troubleshooter, I was certainly a negotiator, I was certainly a peacemaker at times. But I thought that was interesting. And as time went on, the glue was able to relax. Once they got to the point where they were actually writing their novel, after a great deal of improvisation, playful, you know, generating of material, then planning it rigorously, they had such a shared sense of what this was about, chapter by chapter, scene by scene, piece of dialogue. They understood what they had to write. They'd created their own map, if you like, their own blueprint, their own brief, and they were able to do it. And so the glue was able to relax. They took on their own agency. That was a very interesting shift, and it probably happened about halfway through the process. So a novel was written, and it will be online in the final version. I'm just adding media to it at the moment, so I'm not going to show it to you today. These are some of the participants. The lady in the middle, smiling in glasses, is Joanna, who doesn't have a smartphone. But there they are. That's just a few of them. And as you can see, they're sitting around a table in a pub, which was not unusual. So I'm going to cut to the chase and talk a bit about the research outcomes. There were three things, really. I've mentioned already this remediation of practice. This really extended and expanded the role of a community writing facilitator beyond anything I had done before. That's partly because the novel, if anyone here has written one, it's like the marathon of creative writing. It's a big, complex thing. It's big and complex enough for an individual to write on their own, but facilitating the work of many people was a task, and it took me into varieties of project planning, budgeting, you know, monitoring of time scales, breaking down of tasks, you know, beyond anything I had experienced, really. But out of that became a model of participation, which I'll come to in a minute, because the whole process, I was aiming to make it as participatory as possible. I didn't want to be the one making decisions. I didn't want to be the one driving it in the creative sense. As I say, it wasn't a novel I would write. And that I discovered happened, that kind of participation happened in a number of different ways. And coming out of that, the main output of this research is guidance for facilitators. You know, I've done this so you don't have to. Or rather, I've done this so that you could. You know, having done it myself now, I feel in a position to provide a toolkit and guidance. Sorry? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. By the way, here's a fictional menu for the fictional pub in the story. It's all locally sourced. So what is a community novel, very quickly? Well, it's made by a community. It could be made by a neighbourhood, street, village. This one happened to be a parish, or a group of people with a shared interest. Anyone can take part, and this is key. The ability to write, experience of creative writing is not essential. I had many people become involved with this who'd never written, or they hadn't written since school. They certainly didn't think of themselves as writers. They can learn as they go along. We've serialised this one in print in partnership with a community magazine. The volunteers want to self-publish when it's all finished, and it's also been available in serial form online. And the online version has links. It has little extra sort of hidden bits of material which they had written and produced and were very keen to include, but which didn't belong in the whole narrative. So that makes it quite multimodal. It has pictures, video, and sound, as well as words. And it can be about anything. It could actually be about anything. So the 5 methods of participation, you promote, by which I mean you recruit people, you make it known around your community, you reach out to other community organisations and groups, part of the local cultural and social capital. In the early stages, you play. We did a lot of very playful activities to generate material for the novel, and that got them all used to working together. It created trust, and it was a lot of fun. Then you can get down to planning, and this is where narratology came into play. And we used good old Freytag's triangle, which kept us on the straight and narrow. And in the process of that, they were able to fill gaps, go out to other organisations and individuals in the community to help them make decisions. The WI were quite key in our inciting incident. Then you start to produce it, and that's a big sorting exercise. You're producing something that will look like a novel. Travaux is 72,000 words, so it's a proper novel, but it also exists in other forms. And when you publish that becomes evident. So I would say that, yes, I think the answer to the HRC question is yes. The community novel can be a vehicle for a culturally democratic form of participation. And the research will inform the guidance for more to come. I'll just leave you with a couple of examples. This is material generated during lockdown when we were forced on Zoom. Not everybody wanted to do that. We improvised a scene at a public meeting in the story using a PowerPoint presentation by somebody who really wasn't very well prepared for it, which if you can read the notes there, you'll see. One of the participants made a poster for this big sort of music festival that was being proposed, used a band name generator to come up with the band names, and Jim Glasgow there became quite a character in the denouement. We haven't spotted him, but there he was, country and western star. And the poster, you see at the top, the placards, these were made partly by one of the volunteers who cut out animal pictures and masks from magazines. Demonstrators interrupted the meeting wearing these rather freaky animal masks. And somebody else who was locked down at home with her family, they were a sailing family, they dragged an old sail out of storage from their boat and cut it up and made these protest posters out of them. And they found their way into the novel. It was also written up as a set of very long, boring parish council meeting minutes. And it was rendered in the printed version as a local news item. And on the website, there are links to all these other bits of material. I'd better stop now, hadn't I? Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your super interesting presentations. I've got questions more about planning your research and the actual subject matter of all 4 projects. It's very exciting, but because I work for the Arts and Humanities Research Council, this is what I'm interested in. So in order, starting with Steph, your international placement abroad at the Smithsonian, how did you identify the theme for your IPS project, and what's the one most important thing that this placement has given you? Then for Kaajal, the fact that We the Curious had this challenge and you had to switch from one project partner to another, I'm just interested, how did you go about reframing your research project? Did you have to do a lot of that, and what was the process like, and starting that new partnership with the Eden Project as well? And then for Jane, you mentioned the guidance for facilitators and the model of participation as practical outputs of your PhD. Did you have that in mind when you started, or was it more like, have they emerged more organically as additional outputs in addition to the community novel? And secondly, did you encounter any challenges regarding accessibility among your participant group, apart from that kind of digital literacy challenge?
Sorry, was that civility?
Accessibility. Sorry. So yeah, any challenges with this kind of diverse group that you recruited there, apart from people not having access to smartphones or laptops, for example? Sure. Thank you so much.
There's quite a lot of questions in there, so you may not want to address them all at once, so we might need to sort of spread them around the day. But please, kick off.
Yeah, okay. So how I identified the theme. Well, I suppose that the subject was freshwater mussels, which I've been really interested in, because of the way that they are really important for their environment, and they're part of these sort of multi-species ecosystems. But they're also really strange to us. I mean, they don't even have a face. It's really hard to identify with a mussel as a character. And I suppose from a perspective of having been a librarian for a long time, how you tell how you may be able to tell or understand the story of the collection from the perspective of its objects. But also, I mean, it was really I didn't really talk much when I talk about the process of collaboration. I mean, it was all a collaboration. It started with a conversation with John Pfeiffer, the Mussels curator, and even though a lot of it was more academic in the event because I wasn't in the room with them all, and it completely didn't go to plan in that, my plan was it would be much more conversational and we'd be developing these characters through playing a game, but in the end it was reading papers and then talking about the characters. But they really, both of the researchers I worked with, John and Sean, even though this is quite far from what they usually do in scientific research, they really got into the idea of thinking about characters and how they're and they love the mussels. They work with them, they do field work with them. So how different species characteristics could be interpreted for humans as different sort of characters, different character traits. So John was oh, this mussel, the complimatis, is it's like the working class species. It's so common, it's everywhere. Or Sean's research on the Strophitis undulatus, the Pac-Man juvenile. Yeah, so we sort of played with a lot of ideas in a way that was very different to their usual day-to-day research, but also as research zoologists, they're very interested in the forms and the evolution of forms and how they co-evolve in their environments. So different mussels. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I'd just echo what Stephanie was saying. Like, I think the collaborations were really key. So with We the Curious, I didn't know what had happened. They just stopped answering my emails. And I just, it took me a few months, of just reformulating everything to suddenly make this Eden Project partnership central. Because prior to that, Birgit, I don't know if she's here, but she'd previously been working with the Eden Project, and part of her outcomes for her PhD was creating the opportunity for this partnership. And then she advertised it to everyone in the 3D3 cohort, and we had the opportunity to apply, and they were really keen to work together. And then I was like, well, I don't have an industry partner anymore. Would you be willing to become the central partnership that I work with? And then again, the collaboration with both the curators, which was Misha, who then went on maternity leave, and then Celine, who then left, and then Misha again, and then Juliet Rose from the communities team. And they were really interested in the fact that it was something that bridged their artistic program and their communities program. And so it very much then shaped the research.
Briefly, yes. The first question about the toolkit, did I know I was going to produce one? Well, I had a very strong sense from the beginning of who the research was going to be for. And it was going to be for a bit, people like me, actually, community practitioners. But it's gone much further than I thought it would, and that's developed really through the practice research. The question about accessibility, that makes me think about the way we, the volunteers, chose venues and places in which to meet and in which to do the work. And that was anything from very familiar local community halls, village centres, a sailing club. During lockdown, when we could meet out of doors, it was people's gardens, it was benches on a harbour wall, it was an orchard at one point, I think. I'm sure I remember meeting in an orchard in the rain. A churchyard, and these places were kind of deliberately chosen because they proved to be of relevance to the story that was developing, but also they were very familiar to the people who were taking part. This was very, very different. It had to be very different, taking them into something that they perceived as an educational institution. These were their places. This was their kind of habitus. And I made a lot of use of that, and that enhanced the accessibility. That sense that, oh yes, this is for me, this is for us. I can go into that place and not worry